In 1959, police in Scotland opened a dusty file cabinet in the basement of a closed asylum and discovered records of two siblings who had been institutionalized for 47 years, not because they were dangerous or mentally ill, but because they spoke a language no linguist could identify and claimed to come from a place that didn't exist on any map. The record showed that for nearly 5 decades, psychiatrists had tried everything to make them speak English or reveal where they were really from, but the siblings maintained their story with such unwavering consistency that some staff members began to believe them. What makes this case truly disturbing isn't just the decades of institutionalization. It's the photographs found in the file showing the siblings gradually aging in their cells, while the world outside changed completely. And the final entry in the record, dated 1951, that simply reads, "Ceased communication entirely. Both subjects now only speak to each other. We have failed to break their delusion. Recommend permanent containment." Before we dive into these disturbing cases, leave us a comment with what time it is, where you are, and whether you can sleep after these stories. And if you're brave enough not to miss any of our weekly cases, subscribe to the channel now. Turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and let's unravel these mysteries from forgotten police records. Aberdeen, Scotland, 1904. 2 children were found wandering near the harbour on a foggy September morning. A girl approximately 8 years old and a boy around 6. They were dressed in strange clothing that locals couldn't identify, made from fabric with an unusual texture and secured with clasps rather than buttons. Their skin had an odd green tint that doctors initially attributed to malnutrition or copper poisoning, though no source of contamination was ever found. When approached by harbour workers, the children didn't respond to English, Scots Gaelic, or any other language the diverse port population could attempt. They seemed terrified, clinging to each other, speaking rapidly in a melodic language that contained sounds no one present had heard in any human speech. The local constable was called, and the children were taken to the police station, where they would spend the first night of what would become a 47-year ordeal. The police tried everything to identify the children. They brought in translators who spoke dozens of languages from around the world. Given Aberdeen's status as a major port, they had access to speakers of languages from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Europe. None recognized even a single word the children spoke. They showed the children maps, pictures of different countries, drawings of ships and flags, trying to identify where they might have come from. The children would become animated when shown certain images, particularly pictures of islands and coastlines, pointing and speaking urgently in their unknown language, but unable or unwilling to communicate in any way that helped identify their origin. Medical examinations showed they were physically healthy, aside from the strange skin discoloration, which gradually faded over the first few months, suggesting it might have been related to their diet before being found. What disturbed the authorities most was the absolute consistency of the children's behavior and communication. They never broke character, never slipped into English or any recognizable language, maintained their story through exhaustive questioning by police, clergy, doctors, and government officials. The girl, who the staff began calling Anne based on a sound she made frequently, would draw elaborate pictures of an island with unusual architecture, buildings with curved walls, and spiral towers unlike anything in European design. The boy, called James because he seemed to respond to that name, would draw maps showing coastlines and landmarks that didn't correspond to any known geography. Together, they would create what appeared to be written language. Symbols that looked somewhat like a combination of Greek and runic alphabets, but followed different structural rules. After 6 months of investigation leading nowhere, the decision was made to institutionalize the children at the Aberdeen Royal Asylum. This wasn't because they were considered insane in the traditional sense. But because Victorian Britain had no other framework for dealing with people who couldn't or wouldn't assimilate into society, the asylum records discovered in 1959 documented every aspect of the siblings' decades of confinement. The early entries are filled with earnest attempts to educate them, teach them English, integrate them into society. Teachers were brought in daily. They were shown books, taught simple words, rewarded for any attempts at English communication. But Anne and James resisted all attempts at linguistic conversion. They would participate in lessons but only speak their own language, would write only in their unique alphabet, would respond to questions with elaborate answers that no one could understand. As years passed, the institutional approach changed from education to study. Linguists from Edinburgh University came to examine the children's language, recording hours of their speech, analyzing the grammatical structure, trying to determine if it was a legitimate language or an elaborate constructed code. Their conclusion, published in a 1912 academic paper that was largely ignored, was that the language showed all the characteristics of a natural language. It had consistent grammar, a large vocabulary, nuanced expression of abstract concepts, and most tellingly, it evolved over time as the children grew, with their adult speech showing more complexity than their childhood communication. This suggested it wasn't a memorized code, but a living language they were thinking in. But without any connection to known language families, they couldn't determine its origin, leaving the mystery unsolved and the siblings confined. The photographs in the police records tell a heartbreaking story of time passing. In the earliest photos from 1904, Anne and James are children with haunted but still hopeful expressions, holding hands, standing close together. Photos from 1910 show them as teenagers, still together, but their expressions have hardened, their body language more guarded. By 1920, they're adults in their mid-20s, and something has changed in their faces, a deep sadness mixed with stubborn defiance. The later photos from the 1930s and 1940s show them aging in the institutional environment. Their unusual clothing long since replaced with asylum uniforms, but their closeness to each other never diminished. In every single photograph across 47 years, they're touching, holding hands, standing shoulder to shoulder, the only constant in lives stripped of everything else. The records show that the siblings developed their own world within the asylum walls. They would spend hours drawing maps of their supposed homeland, creating elaborate mythologies, celebrating holidays that corresponded to no known calendar. Other patients and staff reported that Anne and James would perform what appeared to be religious or cultural rituals, singing in their language, creating symbols from whatever materials they could access, maintaining traditions from a place that might not exist. Some staff members, particularly those who worked with them for many years, admitted in confidential notes that they sometimes wondered if the siblings might be telling the truth, that perhaps they really had come from somewhere else. The absolute consistency, the lack of any slip-ups over decades, the genuine distress they showed when separated, all of it felt too real to be delusional, feeling that chill down your spine. If you're enjoying these mysteries, leave a like on the video to help us continue investigating cases like these. And in the comments, tell us if you've heard of these cases before or know any different theories. Subscribe so you don't miss the next mysteries. Now, get ready, because what comes next will keep you up at night. The turning point came in 1951, nearly 5 decades into their confinement. Anne, now in her mid-50s, became seriously ill with pneumonia. James, who had never been separated from his sister for more than a few hours in 47 years, was distraught. Staff described him as becoming almost catatonic with fear, refusing to eat or sleep, standing vigil outside the medical ward where Anne was being treated. When she recovered, something had changed in both of them. The records state that they ceased all attempts to communicate with staff, would no longer participate in any activities, would not draw their maps or practice their writing. They turned completely inward, speaking only to each other in whispered conversations, creating an impenetrable bubble of two. The final note in their official records, dated August 1951, is chilling in its defeat. After 47 years, we have made no progress in identifying these subjects or understanding their condition. They have now withdrawn completely into their private world, recommend permanent containment as they cannot function in society, and died in 1952 at approximately 56 years old, having spent 48 years in institutional confinement. The records note that James was present when she died, that he held her hand and sang to her in their language, and that his last words to her were recorded phonetically by a nurse who had worked with them for decades. She later said she believed he was telling Anne they would go home soon. After Anne's death, James stopped speaking entirely to anyone, even to himself. He would sit in his room staring at the walls, occasionally tracing symbols in the air, but producing no sound. He died 6 months later, in March 1953, at approximately 55 years old. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but staff who knew him said he had simply given up, that losing Anne meant losing the only person in the world who understood him, who shared his memories and his language. He was buried in the asylum cemetery in an unmarked grave, as was Anne, their true names unknown, their origin a mystery. Their language died with them. When the records were discovered in 1959, 6 years after James's death, they sparked renewed interest in the case. Researchers tried to find any records of missing children from 1904 who might match Anne and James, but found nothing. They examined the phonetic transcriptions of the siblings' language and compared them to obscure dialects and extinct languages, but found no matches. They studied the drawings and maps, looking for any geographical features that might provide clues. But the landscapes depicted didn't correspond to any known location. Some researchers suggested the children might have been from an isolated community that practiced a unique constructed language as part of their culture. But no evidence of such a community was ever found. Others proposed they might have been survivors of a shipwreck from a vessel that was never reported missing. But harbor records showed no unexplained maritime incidents around the time they were found. The most disturbing theory, and one that gained traction among psychologists studying the case, is that Anne and James were victims of severe childhood trauma, who created an elaborate shared delusion as a coping mechanism. This condition, known as folie à deux or shared psychotic disorder, can cause two closely bonded individuals to develop and maintain the same delusional beliefs, reinforcing each other's alternate reality. Under this theory, the siblings might have experienced something so traumatic that they constructed an entire false identity, including a language and homeland, as a way to escape their real past. The fact that their skin initially had a green tint might have been due to copper poisoning from an industrial accident, which they incorporated into their new identity. The absolute consistency of their story over 47 years would be explained by their mutual reinforcement, each sibling's belief strengthening the others, making the delusion unbreakable. But this theory doesn't explain everything. Linguists who studied the recorded samples of their language noted that it evolved naturally over decades, showing the kind of organic change that occurs in real languages but is nearly impossible to maintain in a constructed one. The drawings and maps, while depicting unknown places, showed consistent internal logic and detail that suggested genuine memory rather than invention. And most puzzling, both siblings maintained their story literally until death, never breaking, never admitting to anything else, even in private moments or during periods of serious illness when people often abandon pretenses. If it was a shared delusion, It was one of unprecedented strength and complexity, essentially creating an entire culture and language that existed only between two people. What makes the case of Anne and James particularly haunting is how thoroughly they were failed by the system. They were children who needed help, understanding, and compassion, but instead they got nearly 5 decades of institutional confinement because they couldn't or wouldn't assimilate. Victorian and early 20th century society had no framework for dealing with people who were different in ways that didn't fit established categories. Anne and James weren't violent, weren't dangerous to themselves or others, weren't unable to care for themselves. They were simply incomprehensible to the authorities, and that incomprehensibility was treated as a form of illness requiring permanent institutionalization. They spent their entire adult lives confined because they spoke a language no one else understood and claimed an origin no one could verify, a punishment for the crime of being inexplicable. The second case in our forgotten police records takes us to America, specifically to Virginia in 1922, where 2 siblings were discovered living in conditions so disturbing that the investigating officers needed psychological treatment afterward. And the case was sealed for 75 years because authorities deemed the details too traumatic for public knowledge. Rural Virginia, July 1922. A mailman reported that he hadn't been able to deliver mail to the Walker farmhouse for several weeks because the mailbox was overflowing and no one answered his knocks. This was unusual because the Walker family, consisting of parents and 2 adult children, were known to be reclusive but had always collected their mail regularly. The local sheriff decided to perform a welfare check. What he found when he finally forced entry into the farmhouse was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The parents, John and Martha Walker, both in their 60s, were dead in their bedroom, apparently deceased for at least 2 weeks based on decomposition. But the truly disturbing discovery was in the root cellar. The Walkers' adult children, Ruth and Henry, both in their 30s, were found in the cellar in conditions that shocked even experienced officers. They were emaciated, filthy, and exhibiting behavior that suggested they had been living like animals. But what made this case particularly disturbing was the evidence suggesting they had been confined to the cellar for most of their lives. The cellar walls were covered in scratches and primitive drawings, layers upon layers of marks, suggesting decades of confinement. There were chains attached to the walls, worn smooth from use, and a collection of bowls and waste buckets that told a story of people kept like livestock. Ruth and Henry couldn't speak coherent English, communicated mainly through grunts and gestures, and seemed terrified of sunlight and open spaces. Medical examination revealed signs of long-term malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies consistent with years of inadequate diet, and psychological damage that doctors said was beyond anything they had seen. The investigation into the Walker family revealed a dark history that neighbors had suspected but never confirmed. John and Martha Walker had moved to the rural property in 1895 with 2 young children. From that point on, the children were rarely seen. The few neighbors who inquired were told the children were sickly and couldn't go out. Over the years, occasional screams were heard from the property, but in an era when parental rights were nearly absolute and rural communities minded their own business, no one intervened. What investigators pieced together from journals found in the house was truly horrifying. John Walker believed his children were born sinful and needed to be purified through suffering and isolation. The journals detailed a systematic program of abuse and confinement that had lasted over 25 years, describing it as spiritual discipline necessary for salvation. Ruth and Henry had apparently spent most of their lives in that cellar. They had been allowed out only occasionally under strict supervision and only at night. They had been fed minimally, taught nothing, given no education, no socialization, no human kindness. The drawings on the cellar walls showed their attempts to process their reality. primitive figures of people, the sun and moon, animals, basic representations of a world they knew existed but had never been allowed to join. Among the drawings were repeated images of two figures holding hands, Ruth and Henry's only comfort in decades of darkness being each other's presence. Like Anne and James in Scotland, these siblings had only each other, but unlike the Scottish children who were failed by institutions, Ruth and Henry were failed by their own parents and by a society that didn't intervene. The most disturbing element of the case was what happened after their rescue. Ruth and Henry were so psychologically damaged that they could never integrate into normal society. They were institutionalized, not as punishment, but because they genuinely couldn't function outside structured care. They had missed all critical periods of development: language acquisition, socialization, education, everything that makes humans able to live in society. Psychologists who worked with them reported that Ruth and Henry seemed to exist in their own reality. They had created private games and rituals, a simplified language between themselves, a shared understanding that excluded everyone else. They were more bonded to each other than most siblings could ever be, having literally only had each other for most of their lives. Attempts to separate them for individual therapy failed. Both would become violent and self-destructive when apart. The case was sealed by court order in 1925 after the siblings were committed to long-term psychiatric care. The judge ruled that the details were too graphic and disturbing for public consumption, and that the surviving siblings deserved privacy in their treatment. But the real reason, revealed when the files were unsealed in 1997, was that the case had exposed such profound failures in child welfare that authorities wanted it buried. Multiple neighbors had reported concerns over the years, but rural sheriff's departments had done nothing. Teachers had noted that the Walker children were never enrolled in school, but truancy laws were rarely enforced in rural areas. Even family members who visited the Walkers and never saw the children had chosen not to ask difficult questions. The systemic failure was so complete that officials preferred to seal the record rather than confront how thoroughly society had abandoned Ruth and Henry. Ruth died in 1963 at age 70, having spent 41 years in institutional care, still unable to speak fluently, still most comfortable in small, dark spaces, still finding safety only in her brother's presence. Henry died in 1967 at age 68, 4 years after losing his sister. Like James in Scotland, Henry declined rapidly after his sibling's death, losing the only person who shared his fractured reality. They were buried in the institutional cemetery, their graves marked only with numbers, their story known to almost no one until the sealed records were finally opened decades later. What connects these two cases of disturbing siblings from forgotten police records is how completely the systems designed to protect people failed them. Anne and James in Scotland were institutionalized for being incomprehensible, spending 47 years confined because they couldn't explain themselves in ways authorities accepted. Ruth and Henry in Virginia were imprisoned by their parents for being born, then institutionalized after rescue because the damage done to them was irreversible. In both cases, the siblings' only source of comfort, support, and understanding was each other, creating bonds so strong that neither could survive long after their sibling's death. And in both cases, authorities chose to bury the records, to forget these stories, because they revealed uncomfortable truths about how society treats people who don't fit, who can't be easily categorized, who challenge our understanding of normal. These cases force us to ask difficult questions. How many other people have been institutionalized or confined simply because they were different in ways society couldn't comprehend? How many children have suffered abuse while neighbors and authorities looked away? How many people have died alone in institutions, their stories untold, their suffering unacknowledged? And how many more forgotten police records sit in basements and archives, containing stories we'd rather not confront because they reveal our collective failures? Anne, James, Ruth, and Henry are just 4 people we know about because someone eventually found their files. How many others were never documented, never remembered, simply erased from history because their stories were too disturbing to preserve? These cases continue to haunt us. If you're as disturbed as we are, leave a like, comment your theories, and share with anyone brave enough to listen. Explore our channel to learn about more unsolved mysteries and the darkest secrets in history. If you haven't subscribed yet, join the brave souls who follow our cases. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss any new cases. Leave your like if this video left you thinking, and share it with that friend who says they're not afraid of anything. Comments are open. Tell us what other disturbing cases you want us to investigate. Until next time, and sleep well, if you can.